When you study human behavior as an expertise, it might make a difference if you studied more than one kind of human. And in behavioral science, the criticism has been for a while, we're too weird. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And you can probably add a couple of others like male and white and older. But it makes a big difference at a couple levels. It makes a big difference in the people we study, and it makes a big difference in the people that we want to be the talent in the industry, whether they are students, professors, or practitioners. And joining us now to take on that challenge of discussing this are Cerita Bethea. She is the head of behavioral science at Coca-Cola. Neela Saldanha with the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. It's a research and advisory firm dedicated to advancing and applying behavioral science for poverty alleviation in the global South. And Grace Lordan, Associate Professor of Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics. Grace, over to you.
Thank you all for tuning in tonight. So if you are a behavioral scientist sitting out there, you'll know that we do tend to study time. So thank you for giving us the privilege of your time. I'm going to speak specifically about weirdness in academia. This is the place where students often get inspired and often make a decision about whether they will actually become a behavioral scientist through taking a module or taking a degree. Students will certainly look to the faculty they meet for inspiration along the way. The first thing that I want to recognize is that behavioral science isn't in itself not a discipline, and it does rely on investigations that come from a number of disciplines, the majority coming from economics and psychologists at the moment. So what I mean by that, if you look around the world and you look at who's branding themselves as behavioral scientists, normally they will have come through either an economics or psychology major and then gone on to do some other masters. Within this, development economists, I think, have pushed the frontier. Not just in behavioral science, actually, but in economics in general. And they have done this by producing an emerging stock of knowledge that relies on field experiments to understand behavior in a variety of contexts, lots of different countries, and more often modeling effects in the short run and the long run. They consider high-stake decisions that really affect real people. They look at adaptation. They think about heterogeneous treatment effects, and they discuss general equilibrium effects. And this is where I would really love to see the field of behavioral science go in general. Because outside development economics, behavioral science academic research is most focused on weird samples. As we've already heard, that's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, developed countries. And it's even more than that. So we tend to focus on highly selected samples, over-relying on our own students and survey respondents as samples, looking at questions that involve low stakes and looking at very short-run effects, very different to the development economists that are up here. And the question then becomes, well, why this research? Well, firstly, the majority of behavioral science modules and degrees are in Western, educated, rich, developed countries, mainly in the UK, Ireland, and the US. And secondly, these studies are actually pretty useful as a first pass to understand human behavior, so they do have a place in the literature. Thirdly, they are actually very cheap to do time-wise, and universities that have behavioral science modules and faculty usually have the structures and resources that make this type of research easy to conduct. And this is a barrier to entry for behavioral science research. And we lose a lot in this pattern by over-focusing on weird samples. So one thing we know for sure as behavioral scientists is that context matters. And by not moving outside such selected samples often enough, we now know too little about behavioral science lessons that are core to human behavior and those that are born out of studying a specific context. This is really important because we're living in a globalized world. So learning whether some of the facts coming out of small weird studies replicate in more interesting populations in the weird countries themselves and beyond is necessary to demonstrate how useful behavioral science is. On this, I think academics and behavioral academics who are behavioral scientists in weird countries that already have the structures and resources in place need to start more actively building partnership with academics, think tanks, and firms in non-weird countries, and just get on with doing research that's outside the weird context. This will give us immediate role models for our students outside the university, and the collaborations will obviously bear obvious fruit for learning. In the spirit of avoiding virtue signaling, which I think is going to be a theme for our panel tonight, and moving towards more committed action, I'm actually setting up a research centre at the LSE in November called the Inclusion Initiative. And I've already committed to taking learnings from the lab into firms in London. So for Nudgestock tonight, I'm also going to commit to doing this in non-weird settings by building the type of partnerships that I've just described. But let's go back to the students now. So universities in North America and the UK are actually creating designated behavioural science departments and hubs that are awarding degrees to students on this topic. I'm a director of an MSc in behavioural science at the LSE. And I'm pleased to say that the students do come from around the world. We have a great representation in the classroom of non-WEAR countries. We have a fantastic pipeline. Let's keep that global pipeline. Let's keep them looking at global questions. But the faculty that face these students are not diverse. For example, the share of males in these universities is greater than 75%. I spent some time today working that out. And more than 90% of the faculty are coming from weird countries themselves. So it's important that universities look at their own hiring practice and prevent against the biases that they study themselves, like familiarity bias, affinity bias, and the halo effect. In addition, we should move as universities away from relying on signals that don't necessarily always indicate talent, such as having gone to an elite university, and fish in a wider pool that is truly global. Finally, it is also important that universities start, and I think this is actually necessary for all disciplines that have a pipeline problem, to hire senior faculty that have a revealed history of nurturing global talent. This is a valuable trait in a new hire, and it's easily visible in a person's CV, so we don't need to rely on what they say. We can look at what they've done in the past. But hiring shifts like this do take time, so it's therefore a good idea to pay attention to what we're actually teaching our students now by having an inclusive curriculum, making sure that we have papers that are from around the world and we're honest about our students about gaps in the literature. We also need to encourage our students in their own research to consider questions that are beyond weird. This is obviously easier if we're doing it ourselves, echoing the importance of partnership buildings. I've already committed to this, but I am one person. So if you're out there tonight and you're an academic in behavioural science or conduct research in behavioural science, maybe you can do the same. If we get to critical mass, we also get to a tipping point that can cause real change, which would be a super cool legacy for Nudgestock Virtual 2020. Thank you all for listening, and I'm now going to hand over to the fantastic Neela.
Thank you, Grace. I think you echoed a lot of what I'm going to say. So we're just going to talk a little bit about my experience actually setting up a behavioral science unit in one of those non-weird countries, which is India. But before that, and this is on my bucket list of things to do, I've always wanted to tell this joke in a party. So, you know, what better than 30,000 people at this Nudgestock party? So there's this man coming after a party. He's a little worse for wear, and he's under the street light, and he's desperately searching for something. And the Good Samaritan comes up and says, "What are you searching for?" And he says, "I've lost my keys." So they both get round to searching, and after hours of fruitless searching, they can't find the keys. So the Good Samaritan says, "Look, we searched everywhere. Are you sure you've dropped your keys here?" And so the man says, "Oh no, I'm pretty sure I haven't dropped my keys here. Actually, I think I dropped them at that corner on the side of the road." And the Good Samaritan says, "Then why are we searching for your keys here if you didn't drop them here?" And the drunk man says, "Oh, that's easy because the light is much better here." And sometimes I feel, in behavioral science that we are those drunk men where we're searching for our keys, where the light is better rather than where the problems actually are. And although you mentioned, Grace, that it's better in development, I still think we have a long way to go. So in 2017, I moved from New York to New Delhi, India, to head up and to set up a Center for Social and Behavior Change at Ashoka University. And the center was funded by a grant from the Gates Foundation. So I was very excited, as you can tell, to sort of kickstart some of that behavioral science capability. And it was an exhilarating journey, but it was also a very hard journey. In retrospect, looking back, I want to lay out some of those barriers based on my experience. And I'll use the Behavioral Insights team Fabulous East framework. We need to make something easy, attractive, social, and timely. So as you mentioned, it's not easy to set up this behavioral science capability because of the talent pipeline. There's a mismatch between talented professionals and what they need to learn in terms of behavioral science. In a country like India, there isn't actually even a behavioral science course or training that people can take. Second, there is no research infrastructure. So you have all these great insights, you want to run experiments, especially with low income and marginalized populations. How are you going to do that? It takes forever to run that. It's not attractive. There's no incentives for global North researchers actually to work with folks in the global South or non-weird countries. And the demand from local decision makers is also quite tentative because they haven't seen this work in their country. So it's not attractive to start something. It's definitely not social. Many times we felt you're the lonely warrior. There's no community. But it was timely, I will say that. It was timely to start to think about that. There was a lot of interest. So I want to talk about one solution, because you did talk, Grace, about partnerships, and you talked about partnership between universities in the UK, with LSE and others. I want to talk about a particular partnership, which is a South-South partnership, which is partnerships between non-weird countries themselves. And remember, that's 88% of the world's population. So there's a lot of scope for partnerships there. So when I was at the center, we actually had this partnership with Busara, with the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. And that's because, we thought that instead of tying up, and not instead of, but in addition to tying up with a lot of the well-known behavior science folks, why not look for someone who had tried to solve the same challenges in the same low resource settings? And lo and behold, Busara, headquartered in Nairobi, had been doing that in Kenya and Tanzania and Nigeria. So it was a great partnership. We worked on a project to look at how we might increase consumption of iron and folic acid tablets amongst anemic women. These are rural pregnant women. What might we do? And it was great because it wasn't the right thing to do, which of course it was, but it was also great because we were both sharing similar challenges. So we set up the research infrastructure. We had this very cool bus that we took out and outfitted with laptops, and actually went to the rural villages instead of having them come to the lab. It was attractive because once we ran about 5 experiments, we were able to show the results of that to policymakers and to decision makers. And so people began to say, oh, that's what you mean by behavioral science applied to my problem. I get that now. So we saw a lot more demand. And of course, nothing better than having someone else facing the same challenges to actually have to talk to. So it really helped to build that community. So I do think one of the missing links that we should really be working on right now is this sort of non-weird or South-South partnerships in addition to North-South partnerships. And these already exist. So what I've been working on in the last few months is really trying to do that on a regional basis. And I would call on everyone to set those goals. We know from behavioral science research, from the work of Locke and Latham, that setting specific goals is better than a do your best. So I'm going to exhort everyone at Nudgestock not to think about doing their best, but to set specific goals. If you're a funder, commit to funding this work as the Gates Foundation did for 2 to 3 years. If you're a professional, commit to working on one of these, set a specific goal. I'm going to end with just this startling statistic. You talked about a tipping point, Grace, and I was reading the work by Erica Chenoweth, and she works actually in a different sphere of revolutions and protest movements, which is quite topical. And here's the statistic. She says no government, she's done a lot of studies on this and looked at all these movements, no government has been able to withstand a challenge from 3.5% of the population. 3.5%, that's the tipping point. So I'm hoping that we're all part of that 3.5%, and let's make it happen.
Great, thank you, Neela. So now I think we are all in agreement that behavioral science is a bit weird, but we also see this weirdness sort of spilling over into the field as a profession. So for all the known benefits of leveraging and employing talent in this space of behavioral and social science, the field still remains largely homogenous. And while I personally can't control for many of the factors that contribute to this disparity, there is one area that I may be able to help close the gap, and I'll talk about that coming up in a minute. The profound behavioral insight upon which this is based is you can't be what you don't see. So one hypothesis I have among many that are out there, I'm sure, is that this disparity, this lack of diversity in our profession, stems from mental models that may constitute what is a real or legitimate science as part of what we call, STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and math. And these mental models may then shape decision-making for a more non-traditional, if you will, career path. So social science, it may not sound rigorous enough or scientific enough or hard enough, to be part of STEM. And even if one buys into, yes, it does belong in there, what can one actually do with it? So enter Exhibit A, that would be me. So I knew from the time that I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I am not making this up, I used to watch Perry Mason on TV with my grandmother, and I knew that I was going to be a lawyer. And I was pretty strong in this all the way through school. And so by the time I entered college, my major was pre-law, and I randomly picked psychology because you could major in anything and then go into law school, and I was going to law school. So I take Psych 101, and by and large, I really like it. Surprisingly so, I was really into it. And then one day, this teaching assistant, African American teaching assistant, came up to me. She wasn't even my teaching assistant for my section. Don't know why she picked me out, but she said, have you ever heard of engineering psychology? And I thought, no, I haven't. And she says, well, I think you should look into it. It may be something that interests you. And I just thought it, a little bit odd, but politely I said, okay. And then she left. And I promise you, I've not seen this woman since taking that Psych 101 class. But I did go and to the psych office, and I looked up engineering psychology. And what do you know? It did seem a bit interesting. And so I sort of stayed with it. And by senior year, I was completing an honors thesis in theories of automaticity. I had paired up with one of the professors, Art Kramer, in engineering psychology to do this. That teaching assistant coming to me to tell me about engineering psychology is my first recollection of a nudge. And it was a nudge that changed the choice architecture for me in terms of considering what might be a viable field in terms of a profession. So I graduated with that degree in pre-law psychology. I promise the degree actually still says pre-law. I went on to graduate school in psychology, and then on to work in the automotive industry and in CPG for a number of years. And now finally at Coca-Cola, where we leverage these principles of behavioral science to inform our solutions that refresh the world and make a difference. And all because of these nudges. Before graduating, actually, let me take one little step back. I asked my advisor, my thesis advisor in undergrad, I said, why does anybody care about these theories of automaticity in the real world? How would anyone use it? And he gave me a couple of examples, and he says, well, but maybe that's something you can solve. And that was my second nudge, if you will. And so everything that I've done after that, my whole trajectory in this profession of behavioral science is a direct result of those two nudges in particular. And so I submit to you that at this point in time where we have this lack of diversity in our profession, that we don't have to fall off the cliff over it. It may be as simple as each one of us, and that's what, 27 to 30,000 that's participating in this conference, to identify the mental models of those underrepresented groups in our respective markets. That may act as barriers to entry, and then take the time to nudge them and change their choice architecture. And so I pledge, my commitment is to go back home. I am from Chicago, and so my commitment is to go back home to my high school, Hyde Park Career Academy on the south side of Chicago, and bear witness to what is possible. You can't be what you can't see. I need them to see what they can be. And then, I think that in terms of the profession as a whole, particularly for those private companies in our industry, I would offer 3 recommendations for you to increase and help us close this gap in diversity that we have. One would be to work alongside your your internal diversity networks. Oftentimes in companies will have, the African American network, the Asian network, the LGBTQ network, the Latino network. Work alongside those to go into your community and provide that exposure to students when they are most impressionable, when they're thinking about what is it that I want to be when I grow up, and then provide that exposure to the disciplines of behavioral science. And everyone doesn't have to be a psychologist. Within behavioral science, we have economists, we have sociologists, we have anthropologists and neuroscientists. But the exposure, that awareness, that nudge, if you will, I think will get us a long way. Number 2, recruit from HBCUs in the United States, or those institutions where you have a larger population of those underrepresented groups. And 3, be deliberate in practicing unconscious bias in hiring. So I open it up to questions. I think all 3 of us.
Thank you. Yes, I've got some questions coming in. And to the audience, you can use Slido. If you go to slido.com and look for Nudgestock, type that in there, you'll hit our event and you can type in your questions. And I'm going to go looking at those now. First question that I'll pull up here is, are behavioral scientists blind to their own biases, says the questioner. And I'll let you, you just indicate to me who wants to take each one of these questions. Go ahead for it, Grace. Unmute yourself, Grace.
There is a bias that's called bias blind spot that basically talks about the fact that just because we know about the biases doesn't necessarily mean that we don't succumb to them. So I can say for sure that behavioral scientists do succumb to the same biases as everyone else. And I think when I spoke about hiring, I do encourage us as a profession to look at similarity bias, familiarity bias, halo effect in the same way as we would expect anybody else in another profession to do. Just because we know about it doesn't mean that we stop it.
Absolutely agree. We are humans first. So yes, we are subject to the same biases.
I just want to add, in addition to the biases, it's the intent to action gap. So the same reason that we don't move on our diversity efforts is the reason we hit snooze on the alarm clock in the morning. We want to do it, it's just too much effort. So we push it back and it's too overwhelming. So I do think that's something that it's not people don't want to do it. It's just getting from intent to action.
The next question here is, what are your thoughts on recruitment quotas for diversity? Who'd like to tackle that one?
So this,
okay.
Yeah, I was going to leave it for Cerita because you're in private company. So do contradict me if you think this is wrong. I mean, I think that quotas are only there when we're not seeing heterogeneity anyway. So it gets us to a place that we need to be. I would prefer if it happened in a different way. So for example, I do a lot of work in financial and professional services firms, and it's much better for people to be hired, recognizing that the customers of these firms actually are extraordinarily diverse. So for example, they tend to be 50% men, 50% women, but we don't get that gender representation on boards and in a lot of jobs throughout the organizations. And without those quotas, we wouldn't move the boat, because we had tried for many years and it didn't actually happen. So I think it's a way to get us to a status quo, which is a good status quo for firms, but it would be better if we actually recognize the benefit and the value that people are bringing to the organization.
I also think quotas help to force us to expand networks. So the default is the 5 people you know and the 5 people they know. And this happened with us at the center as well. You don't intend to be homogenous, you end up being like that. Because especially when there's a time limit on hiring, you've got an urgent project, you'll just default to who you know best. And our networks, often end up being more homogenous than we realize. So it really forced us. We didn't have hard quotas, but it forced us to say, no, let's not just go with this person, but let's look further and let's actually push a little more and let's actually try and get different profiles in. And I agree with the value of diversity. It brings in new thought.
Absolutely.
Here's a question. Go ahead, Cerita.
Oh, go ahead. No, I agree. I agree with my peers here. And, you know, to the extent that we're taking the effort, making the effort to search for that talent and have them have that representation of talent as part of the consideration set at the very least, and then make sure that we are applying those sort of tenets of unconscious bias when we are hiring. That more so than a quota per se is going to move us in the right direction of having better or greater diversity.
And you do need to be careful about backfire effects with quotas. So, and this is where data science can help us. So there's some evidence to suggest that the quotas here in London kind of led the daughters of the previous CEOs to be hired as compared to their sons. So you might then ask, is that true diversity if we're kind of shifting towards everyone still being in the upper class, but just shifting across gender? So I think moderating whether or not there's crowd out effects across other groups becomes very important.
Last question here. Any advice for the current Black Lives Matter protests to get meaningful change using behavioral science for all three of you?
So for me, it's about, for people who are out there saying that they care about Black Lives Matter, where they have resources, that they're pledging those resources now. So their words are followed by a commitment to action that's visible and that can actually be followed up.
Absolutely. And that's why I think all of us, you've heard from all three of us talking about what we are committing to do. So I think that, yes, it's awesome that money is being given, you know, to various organizations. We need to continue doing that, but that needs to be very quickly followed with some actions as well.
And my only thought is the 3.5%, you know, let's have that sustained participation. And what Cerita said about you can't be what you can't see. So it's incumbent on all of us who are non-Black to actually be out there so that it doesn't get seen as just, you know, a particular movement, but it's a universal movement. Well,
Nudgestock is very grateful for you to come here and talk about this. And I think more than talk, it's clear that in its 8th year, Nudgestock is also just as guilty as the rest of behavioral science or many fields of science. And we genuinely take that on board. So beyond the talk, we look to your guidance going forward as well. So Cerita Bethea, Neela Saldanha, and Grace Lordan, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.